have any questions? See her hand first and then yours, sister. She had her hand first, yes.
Are you suggesting that if there are few black teachers, then, or you said there are few black teachers, it's hard to get more black teachers? Because there aren't pre-service teachers that want to go into it, is that what you're saying?
I think I was making the case that we know that there's a declining pipeline of teachers staying and teachers coming in. And so what my particular focus was in looking at the teachers that are coming in and what may be complicit in why they decide to go all the way through a teacher education program but not teach, why they decide to not continue in a teacher education program. And even more of a narrow lens for me, I'm looking at their experiences as they're learning about diversity, race, racism, and social justice. I'm not sure I answered your question, so keep going.
Yes, so I'm a librarian and I'm looking at the same issues, not as a researcher, but in the practicality, we don't have enough librarians of color in the pre-service librarians in the pipeline. And then at the other end, librarians of color are hired but don't stay long. And trying to get my institution to look at why that might be and try to work on it.
Yeah.
It's comparable.
Yeah. Now, I won't be so naive and just say that, their experiences in their teacher education program as they learn about diversity, social justice, multiculturalism is a panacea for, why there's a declining number of African American teachers entering and remaining in the program. We know that, certainly pay, pursuing other job opportunities, that is a part of it, but that is not the singular narrative. And that's been pushed as the singular narrative when we look historically at African American teachers. We've never pursued our jobs as teachers. We never pursued education solely focused on our own economic benefit because we knew that it wasn't there's not a big economic benefit there. So it was about something larger, something more transcendent that Teresa Perry in her work in the book Young, Gifted, and Black that she wrote with Claude Steele and Asa Hiller really does a wonderful job just laying out the theory of achievement that has carried and been sort of a philosophy for African Americans from our earliest of times on an American soil until presently. It still existed presently. Some other work that I've been doing looks at the continuation of that philosophy of education as it manifests itself in African American pre-service teachers, the different permutations. So it's not going to be exactly the same, but it's there.
You were next. You had your hand next.
Okay, so when I looked at the title of the panel, Pedagogies of Liberation, I kind of thought the panel was going to be more about critical consciousness and critical pedagogies. But from what I understand, I think of this panel that it's about culturally relevant teaching, high quality teaching, community, knowing the community and knowing yourself. But when you think about this other discourse around critical pedagogies, which is critical consciousness and teaching kids about the structures of oppression that kind of infiltrate their lives and prevent their achievement, is that needed as much as we think it's needed in urban schools, or is it just what you guys are saying is kind of good teaching, culturally relevant teaching? Is there a space in your work for this critical consciousness? Is it needed?
I think mine speaks to critical consciousness, definitely, because I look at what I do with Deciphers as a pedagogy of liberation, emancipating oneself from, for lack of a better term at this moment, not knowing, I don't want to say ignorance, but not knowing that one is an African, because we have these battles about blackness internally that say, well, I'm not an African, or, I'm American, or I ain't never met nobody in Africa. And having been married to a man from Africa whose other children were born in this country, they don't want to identify as African, and they have the cultural connection. So there's something about this country and the culture and climate of this nation that makes us dislike Africa and being African. And that's what I'm trying to find. So definitely my work speaks to that and is working in that. It may not use that exact language, but I think what I hear you asking is, should we be more direct with that particular language, saying this is critical consciousness, this is, is that what you're concerned?
No, I mean, I don't, because you guys are just so much more positive. Even though what you're saying is liberation, right? But it feels like this other discourse, this other way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Is, I don't know. I mean, because I feel conflicted about the other way.
Well, they're not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
The job of a surgeon is to first dissect the problem or identify it precisely first, but you can never stop there. It's really getting at the prescriptions. Corporations like people who can problem solve. See, identifying the problem alone is not sufficient enough. So I think in the theme of the 3 papers, you are getting critical, and you're also getting the models or examples of success too at the same time. I think you're getting some historical analysis too about a time when there were many African Americans who were in the teaching profession. But nationally in 2017, the United States has, I think, a problem, the data shows it, in the evaluation and the status of the teaching profession. I think it has evolved a bit, and where we are now, we're in a very crucial time. There's a national teacher shortage, and the attrition and turnover is very high, especially in low-income schools, they call them. But there are also low-income school districts that are doing well in terms of school performance, and we are not studying very well districts that perform well and schools that perform well with what is the school achievement level for low-income white students.
Right.
Look in the NAEP data and see if rural white kids have even 35% proficiency in reading in elementary. It's very bad for them too. Notwithstanding, the minority situation is very particular because of historical processes and ongoing institutional racism and systems of oppression. And as we noted earlier, if you look at what they're proposing in the forthcoming budget for education, I think it is giving us a glimpse of what the next school reform is going to look like. They are defunding everything and anything that's tied to Melanie's paper about minority teachers, any allocation that would go for that. In fact, in many states, the additional pay if you got your master's degree beyond the baccalaureate degree is no longer in effect. Governors of states are making that decision. In North Carolina, the colleges of education are suffering because why would you go into additional debt for the master's degree when the state is no longer giving you additional pay for the higher degree attainment? And I think that is affecting the enrollment statewide. Enrollment is down in colleges of education across the state of North Carolina, but according to the Chronicle of Higher Ed, there are several states that are having similar challenges. The other thing too we have to put in the conversation, although teaching has never been a high-paid profession, in a market-based economy, the pay of the professions are tied to the economy of capitalism. That's very unfortunate because high-achieving countries tend not to have that model. So the other part of understanding school reform is I think we have to study too comparative data on school achievement and comparative school reform across countries. Do we know anything about what the highest performing countries are doing with that piece? How do they prepare teachers? How do they pay them? What is retention like? What is job satisfaction like? And what are the students saying? Because they're performing, and in many of the studies, outperforming us, is something to think about.
The school that you did a case study on that you were calling
Yes.
Harriet Summer School, what state and county was that in?
Southeastern states, since it's an IRB approved study, I can say Southeast, I could say Georgia,
Okay.
I can say an urban city. Most students in the school are majority black. I can say the school performance data clearly shows they're more than 30% higher in achievement than the entire state.
Is that
Consistently, 17% higher than the entire United States as well.
I did have a, did you have a question?
No.
I did have a question.
Yes,
So you shared, some findings from
yes,
students,
yes.
and of course, the one that really spoke to me was, when the students talked about teachers, right?
Yes.
Did you get any insight from teachers, like any data
Yes.
on teachers?
Yes. So in my case study of a high performing school, we interviewed teachers, principal, students. From the teacher standpoint, the teachers, as you're saying, Melanie, in your study, they chose the teaching profession as, not to use a common vernacular, but calling, if you will, is something Melanie said in her study. They like the school because the leadership is supporting them in teaching what they call multicultural curricula. In other words, they're covering the state curriculum and some. Anything you'll find in the state standard is in the curriculum, but a whole lot more.
Yeah.
They're not bound to it, and the administration is supporting them in the delivery of that content.
Right.
And I think that's a big key.
Yeah.
When you have to teach this and you have to hide to erase this board quick before principal so-and-so come because your job might be in jeopardy, is a sort of taxation that's very heavy.
It is.
Is akin to when colleges of education sometimes ask the minority faculty to teach the diversity class and hold them hostage on the student evaluation at the same time. So what diversity are you going to teach? But you have to watch every word you say, because let the students evaluate you that you talked about slavery in there, you talked about a book about, what is this?
Really focused on African
All right,
Americans.
and let them write it in the evaluation. The administration take the same evaluation now to decide if you gonna get a job. You see how unfair that? So to answer your question, they love that piece of it. But go ahead. Look like you're gonna ask something.
About the teachers, what's their demographics? Like, how many were African American?
Yes. This is a smaller size school. Most of the teachers are African American, and 90% or more of the students are African American. And in my study is a private school in a low income neighborhood. The data on private school achievement too would surprise a lot of people. They think that private schools are by default high performing. That's very interesting too. The data doesn't show that most private schools are high performing, especially in the time of vouchers, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And a lot of people are aware, even when you have a voucher, most of the time the voucher cannot cover the tuition of the school the child supposedly will have the option to go to, so the families will still have to have money. So that's a piece of it. So the demographic, majority African American teachers, mostly all black, and the administration as well. And student population, the school went up to middle school.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. Thank you.
This has been a really interesting panel to sit in on. Have any of you been in contact with the sessions that happen here every year on the Teachers Workshop?
Yes.
So you know Levon Neal?
Yes, I was there yesterday.
Good, good,
Yes,
good.
yes.
Because I was gonna recommend, I mean, especially your point about the pipeline of teachers.
Yes.
You know, it would be useful for you to engage with her
Yes.
and her group.
Yes.
They typically do that workshop on the Thursday, I guess the Thursday
Yes.
morning of the conference, yeah.
Yes.
But she's still around and her team is still around.
Yes.
So I would strongly recommend that all of you, engage, meet, you know,
Yes.
talk with them, because I think there's great overlap between what you all are doing and what they're trying to do.
Yes.
In terms of provide resources, tools, support, for teachers and, black teachers and
Yes.
students.
Yes.
What's her name?
Levon Neal,
Neal, yes.
she's at Northern Illinois University,
Yes.
but, she's around. If you have a card or something, after the session, I'd be happy to pass it along to her and let her know that, she should try to reach out, to you.
Yes.
Okay.
There were over 40 teachers from Cincinnati Public School there yesterday, and over 20 scholars, over 20 public school students.
Which is
And
low, I mean, in past years, they've had far more students.
far more,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes.
And other students, are they presenting
Yes,
research?
they presented too
Okay.
yesterday. The teachers were taught, and then the students were taught, and the students came back and presented before the teachers.
Right.
And-
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. So there's a much bigger population of students that participate
Yes.
beyond just the ones that present. And you were
That's
talking about the presenters, I
Yes.
misunderstood you.
Yes, sir. And Geneva Gay was the keynote in that particular session.
So you sound very familiar with.
I was
with-
there.
Oh, okay. Is this the first time you'd attended the
No,
workshop?
no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you know
Oh, yes.
Levon and her team?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay,
Yes,
well,
sir. Yes.
perhaps you could facilitate an introduction?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great.
No problem.
Because that would be, I think, useful to them and to you all.
Yes, 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 I know her well. Yes,
Good.
sir.
This question is for Melanie. Melanie, can you talk a little bit more about what double taxation was? I know you didn't go into it in the presentation, but.
Yeah.
just a brief-
Yeah, so I use that term, I'm kind of drawing historically, so we know that when public schooling gained life in America, in the South particularly, based on the efforts of formerly enslaved African Americans. So when the idea of public schooling came to life, and the powers that be decided to start funding schools, they funded them disproportionately, right? They funded white schools at a higher rate than they did schools for African Americans. But African Americans were still obligated to pay their taxes, although that money went to support white schools. So African Americans came out of their pocket. They were double taxed in a sense to provide for what they knew their kids need, in addition to paying to support schools that their kids couldn't attend. So I draw on that idea of double taxation. What I noticed with my pre-service teachers was that even when they were in courses focused on diversity, multiculturalism, and they weren't getting the type of learning experiences that their tuition dollars had paid for, they were still required to do the readings that everybody else was, but they would burn the midnight oil searching and seeking out on their own frameworks, readings that made sense to them. So in one instance, one young man talked about how he read on his own Black Teachers on Teaching. And I didn't share this, but I engaged in 3 semi-structured interviews with each participant. And that book came up every single time. It was a critical piece for him because he was at an institution, a PWI, where all of his professors were white. And so he quite clearly noticed that he needed a different perspective on teaching and education. And so he particularly sought out that book, and actually chose to do a presentation on it in his senior class in front of, for the professor and for his classmates. And so it's this idea of, I've gotta meet these standards, I've gotta read and do these type of activities and things that my tuition dollars are paying for, but it's not giving me the learning, it's not giving me what I need, it's alien to me, so I've got to spend more time seeking on my own the kind of things that will give me what I need to be successful based on my own understandings.
Kind of repeat the name of the book.
It's called Black Teachers on Teaching. It was by Michelle Foster. She published it in 1997, and it's a seminal work looking at, it's a compilation of life history interviews that she did with teachers in different eras. Yeah. And the thing is, it wasn't required in the curriculum. So he had to seek it out. It wasn't even a supplemental reading. He had to seek that out on his own. Imagine what it could be like for African American pre-service teachers, for all teachers, if they got to enjoy that perspective as part of their curriculum and talk about some of the things that those teachers bring up in their life history narratives.
Other questions? We have about, I think, 10 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Was it 10 to 11:30 or 10 to 11:30? 11:45. Okay, so we have 15 minutes, yes? Is it 11:30?
Yeah, but I know I gotta go.
Yeah, so she gotta go to the next section, okay.
Did any of the teachers, and I think I heard Bill answer this, get any training in what to do if they walk into an all-white classroom? Or was it about what poor little white people would have to do if they walked into an all-black classroom? Was there anything for African Americans about how you deal with that
Being in a
situation?
predominantly white school, that's a great question. I didn't ask them that specifically, but here's what I did find out. So when I specifically asked them about their experiences in courses focused on diversity and multiculturalism, the standard, the norm was always white people going into communities of color and what white people need to do to go into communities of color. That was the standard. But when they were in their regular content methods courses, it was always white children. The context was always, okay, use these methods, use these approaches, in this setting, in this context. And that context was always, from what my participants told me, middle class, white children, context in schools. So when we're talking about, when they were talking about diversity and multiculturalism, it was framed around this kind of deficit language of, how do we get, the white teachers prepared to go and deal with, the supposedly unruly masses, right? Because they're so different. But then when we're talking about content, math methods, reading methods, the context is white middle class children.
They ever talk about African American children other than in that diversity project?
Not from what came out of the findings here. And so when Dalvin talks about, we never go into it, we just focused on the happy-go-lucky kids. So the subtle kind of reading between the lines is we're talking about children for whom schools were designed and schools typically work for them because the culture of school aligns with their own cultural socialization. But that's a very good question. I want to go closer into my data with that.
Yes, sir.
Just an observation, maybe a question for your idea of the pipeline. I used to work for a urban school district, and it was in this period where NCLB had just tightened all of the teacher, there was some jargon, fully qualified.
Highly qualified.
Highly
Yeah.
qualified,
Yep.
highly qualified teachers. They didn't have any close to that number.
Right.
And so they allowed waivers. Some of the best teachers in the district were mid-career African-American professionals who had maybe, when they were going through the post-ground college thing, they were good in math and everybody steered them into engineering and, you know, that kind of stuff. And he had been there for 10 years and decided, you know, this isn't for me, you know, there's more to life than just making money. And that whole notion of a calling, they were coming back often taking a pay cut. They were the strongest teaching pool they were mature, been through ropes, but lived in the community and knew the students, and you could teach them how to teach, you know, that, but and they cared about the kids.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the current certification systems are, but I think that's the potential pool out there, because I think there's lots of carrots drawing talented Black and Hispanic kids towards, you know, other places other than teaching, given the status of teaching.
Yeah.
But bringing them back home, I think is
That's a
create
good
the
point.
doors.
That's a good point. Linda Darling Hammond just published some work in 2017 about looking at Black teachers, Black women teachers specifically. So she looked at a large data set. I'm not sure what the data set is. I think the data set was from 2011, maybe to 2012, 13. But she found that there is a high rate of African American teachers, African American women teachers, who gain licensure and certification through alternative certification means and emergency preparation programs. So that's definitely, that can be a promising avenue. That's actually how I got my certification to teach, actually. I think it can be a promising avenue, but I think there is kind of a dichotomy within teacher education such that we kind of we don't rally behind that, because teacher education programs and teacher educators, we're struggling hard trying to defend our legitimacy, right? And rightfully so. I would love to see more of a strong impression, our partnership between teacher education programs and alternative certification programs.
Or maybe your style of research would help kind of identify some of the barriers that those mid-career folks have.
Yeah.
I think that they would welcome the opportunity to get the quality of pre-service training that you get in a regular pre-service program, but they can't afford to not get paid.
Right.
And put out tuition money and then do free student teaching and all that stuff that, you know, they can kind of bypass through the alternative method. And so they get shortchanged.
Yeah.
And then they get abused because they're on the bottom of the salary scale, because none of other experience counts for anything. And
Yep.
your notion of double taxation happens on a number of different levels.
Yeah, and I think that's a reality. I mean, I know Darling Hammond noted that, and there are some really innovative programs out there that have residency programs, but there's not nearly enough, right?
Yes, ma'am. Just want to share that, and I don't know who all in the room might have information they can share with all of us, but one program, it's not pre-service, but really can reach young people, like change their mindset about going into education. And I think folks can look at that. It's a Children's Things Fund Freedom Schools. Arnie Duncan had done a clip and said, in visiting the Freedom Schools training, so he has never seen another program such as Freedom Schools where they're able to reach Black males. And I'm from Pittsburgh, and we've been having Freedom School, I think, like 12 years. So the number of young people who have changed their minds about going into education.
Really?
Oh, yes. It's times I've been from the national training, been in the airport, and Latino young people say, how am I gonna tell my family I'm not going into medicine, I'm going into teaching now. So it's the training that they get, the Freedom Schools training that the servant leaders get, that really change their mindset about education. And our particular site, we've had a number of young people who've gone into education. But part of the problem is, it's not so hard getting our young people to college, but getting them through. And so we don't build in measures for success for that. And programs designed to recruit, particularly our young Black males, to go into education, but you have to help them along the way. You just can't like bring them into one fold and leave and go on to the next thing, and then any continued, support. And the right kind of training with that, and the right kind of support systems, have to be built in. There's a group of black men in Philadelphia who started, they meet collectively, I think they meet once a month. And it's growing. I know some other, groups across the country doing the same thing in terms of how are we sustaining
Right.
our young black people going into education, and those who are in the field, how to keep them in.
That's a very, exciting idea to think about. It makes me think about, I'm sorry, what's your name? Lynette, it makes me think about your questions about this idea of critical consciousness, is it needed? Because if you look at the Freedom School pedagogy, critical consciousness, you know, emancipatory pedagogy is the basis. And so we're looking at the potential of that to recruit and retain, or definitely recruit young people into education. So that, for me, answers your question, Lynette, is it necessary?
Right.
Yes, because I think it's the kind of education that they're getting, that steers them towards a career in teaching, the possibilities of what they can do and who they can help and who they can serve.
And is it
That's
a way-
really interesting.
Is it a way of fighting back?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is
And
it
to
a
hear
way
these
of?
young people
yeah.
say, Freedom School changed my life.
Mhm.
I hear that over and over from the first time I did Freedom School till up to now. Freedom School has changed my life, so their outlook on education is different. Their outlook
Right.
about knowledge of
Mhm.
self is different. Their
Mhm.
outlook on service to children is different. It's just phenomenal. It's phenomenal outlook.
Do you know if they keep data on, do they track, do they kind of follow kids in terms of what they do and where they go in their further educational pursuits?
As far as I know, no.
Hmm.
I don't even think they do it on a national level. I doubt very seriously on the different local levels they do, because they don't have the resources to do it. You know, I think the national wants to do that. I know they struggle for years to try to figure out, how can we say Freedom School works? We know it does,
Right.
but how do you put that in the form for, in terms of a study and get the data from that? So they finally kind of put something together, some surveys or whatever, that seem to have been working, but I don't think, what you're asking they've done, because they just don't have capacity.
It seems like they would need a model like what Bob Moses did when he came back to Mississippi. He kept working with a group of sixth graders at Brigham Middle School, and he stayed with them through high school at Lanier when they graduated in the 12th grade. And they were collecting things and doing that level of work, and that's around the time that I was working with him. But that was part of that mission. He was actually there for 10 years total, back in Jackson, Mississippi, but also going up to the Delta, the different algebra project schools, and trying to implement that algebra project curriculum around math literacy and math literacy workers. So it would take that person or the academic grounded into the community that would actually be a part of the community to actually help facilitate the research and collection of data and stuff that was needed. So sometimes it requires moving into that space and doing that kind of qualitative research methods along with the quantitative research methods and the collection of the data. Yeah, so it's different.
The other layer of this too is that the colleges of education, they are a reflection too of that low representation. So why, when you recruit students in, like the gentleman was saying, and also on the panel, they have difficulties finishing. In the college-bred Negro, W.E.B. Du Bois has the best data on the completion of African Americans in higher ed up to 1910, college-bred Negro. And the top two professions at that time were clergy and teaching. And so when we look post-Brown, as was noted and so on, in colleges of education, when you do recruit minorities in, you have very few minority faculty too, who can sometimes support in ways and also in content too, to support these pre-service teachers. Very few, and the few that are there are often on the margins or on the fence because they're in a space
Yeah.
that was not intended for them. So
Yeah.
there are several layers. Someone asked about, do the minority faculty have any training on how to deal with the majority group, or are the minority teachers trained on how to deal with white students? Well, the white students are basically the norm for the whole curriculum.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
teacher certification assumes that you're going to teach all white kids.
Mhm.
But,
It's
but
one
there's
of
no
the-
training for African Americans
Uh-huh.
to deal with that. Right.
Actually,
African American teachers
Teachers, yeah.
yes. Actually,
to deal with the kind, from a critical perspective, to deal with a Eurocentric curriculum,
how
or?
to teach whites.
How did, I understand the whole curriculum.
White is
system,
Right,
considered the
right.
default,
But
right?
it's, pardon me,
I was saying white is considered the default, but go ahead, yeah.
but it's a different experience for African Americans to walk into
A white
a
class.
white classroom.
Oh, certainly.
So to prepare them kind of from a critical race or culturally
Right,
relevant
exactly.
standpoint of how
Yeah,
to
that's what
be
I'm
in this
saying.
brown body
And
Yes,
teach white
that's what I'm
students.
in a white space.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, I get what you're.
Right.
Yeah.
Do we
Yeah.
make the assumption that we already know that because of the nature of the country and we have to deal with white people anyway? Do we make that assumption?
Yeah,
That seems like a fair question though, right?
right.
Yeah.
Like, we've already been encoded on how we supposed to act around white folk. At least that's what my research.
Yeah.
So do we make, is that a fair leap?
But
I-
the leap to the institution.
Right.
What are you gonna face as a first-year teacher with a white principal and people questioning your legitimacy
Right.
and that stuff?
Right.
Is maybe
And-
what
yeah.
she's talking about in terms
And,
of.
and how do you interpret that in a healthy way?
Right.
Right, I think that's
And where do
the
you find
education.
sources
Right.
of support
Yeah.
Yes.
that help you
Yeah,
get through
that's.
that?
Because in the
I
community, it's
was
rooted in
clear
survival.
Well, to be frank with you,
with that. We already got that.
the teacher education program is assuming, notwithstanding the race of the teacher, that you are going to be teaching in white spaces. Now, for the minority to teach in a white classroom, there is a preparation for that too. Probably by life
Yeah,
and probably by the institution that you're getting your degree.
College of Hard Knocks.
Hidden curriculum.
Yeah,
That's why it's written.
that is part of it, both in the content you have to master is assuming white audience. Both in what is expected in the pedagogy is assuming white
White
audience. Disposition is assuming white audience and their system set in motion to reprimand you too if you don't master that terrain. So that is part of the training and development.
But I'm,
Now, the hiring.
But that goes to the cultural thing of even when people come to the country as immigrants, they're expected to blend into what is considered to be white, to be a citizen or to be successful or to be accepted. So I'm looking at a much larger scale of what you're saying. It's about a white space, period. It doesn't matter where you come from, who you are. We have created this white thing and everything has to go to, it has to fit into this, it has to be white, it has to be or become white.
Well, there's some interesting research on what they call cognitive allocation. Cognitive allocation that minorities use in white spaces, both in teaching and in personal life. But it is less common that a minority cognitive allocation. It is less common that a black teacher gets hired to teach in a majority white school
Right.
with a white audience.
Right.
The hiring,
Yep.
like if you're in my College of Ed and we have the Office of Field Experience where they're gonna do placement, is very rare. Those principals and superintendents, they're very rare they ever selecting black minority, not a black male either.
Mm.
No matter how good, not for that space.
Mhm.
A lot of
Mhm.
assumptions.
Mhm.
And if you went there to teach there, you will have to be very good beyond the
Like a
reasonable good to make it in that. So that's not, it is part of the discourse and issue